Hello, everybody, and welcome to Handmade Hero. I wanted to take a look. Well, there's two things we could do today, and I think I'm just going to pick one of them because I don't actually have a lot of experience with the other, and I was going to be... Yeah, let me show you what we're doing here. So if you take a look at the currently running version of this game, which is I should probably put it in release mode because we don't actually care right now about debugging anything, and I think I had it in debug mode because I was doing that Remedy BG. A lot of people saw that Remedy BG video. I don't know how many people were actually convinced to give it a try. I hope a fair number of people were, but I did this video, if you didn't see it, on the Molly Rocket channel. But there's basically a video up here that I did where I put, it had 15,000 views, which is, it's not a huge number of views, but it's pretty good for a weird, niche programming channel like mine is. That's still a lot. The average videos maybe only get about half of that. You know what I mean? So, hopefully, some people maybe got interested in Remedy out of that, but I did a video where I basically said, here's a bunch of stuff that I think is cool about Remedy that's, stuff you maybe aren't going to do in Visual Studio or whatever, and that was kind of cool. But, in general, back to Handmade Hero, we are at a stage where, at some point, I would like a glow shader. When you get these little panels that are going to light up on the floor, I want them to kind of glow. And so when we do the final resolve, we're going to need a pass over that does some bloom. Probably no halation because there's two things that cause the light to appear outside of the region where the light actually is. So if you have a bright thing like this, right, in a darker area, there's two things that people are used to seeing, and they come from film. They're not really real things that happen in... one of them sort of maybe is, the other definitely isn't, that happen in the real world with your eye. But film, when you film things that are bright, you get two effects that happen. One is a thing that's very specific to film. It's called halation. And what halation is film is like a stack of sheets that respond to color, wavelength of light. There's a blue, a green, and then a red sheet from the top to bottom. And then there's a thing called an anti-halation layer. And then there's the actual film substrate, the back piece. And what happens is when you have a lot of photons striking the film, not all of them actually get absorbed. Not all of them strike the silver halide particles in the actual layers that are supposed to receive them, and that would get exposed, the negative, that would get exposed. And those photons hit this thing called an anti-halation layer, which tries to absorb as many photons as it can. It's as pure black as it could be in a way. It doesn't reflect anything. But even that isn't perfect. So if you have a really bright exposure on a film, what happens is some of those photons bounce back up and expose the red layer, sometimes the green layer, rarely ever the blue layer of film. And so what you'll see in film is there's a orange-red, because, the blue layer is not really getting affected, a orange at the brightest to red, dark red at the outside fringe around things, and that's called halation. That's one of the effects, and it's very specific to film and wouldn't really be appropriate in this game. I'm probably not going to add, film grain to this game because it's kind of cartoony looking. I probably wouldn't add vignetting, which is something that you see sometimes. I also wouldn't add red, green, blue distortion, which is a lens distortion thing. These are lots of things you see in indie games now that try to make things look better for low-end art or whatever. I wouldn't add most of those, and I wouldn't add halation either, because those are all very film-specific effects, and I don't think they're very appropriate here. So really what we'd be talking about adding is what's called a bloom, filter, although it's a really bad name because there's another thing called a bloom filter that has nothing to do with visuals. What it actually is simulating is light scattering errantly in the lens aperture, so in the actual camera assembly. So what happens is photons, when you have a lot of them, like a very bright layer, or if you're just shooting in the sun. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those things where you put cameras have these snouts that there's a thing after the lens that's just like a hood that goes over it that's long. Really what all that kind of stuff is it's to prevent stray photons from bouncing around inside the lens assembly and hitting random places on the film back, right? But even if you do that so that you have a narrow channel and you're just receiving light from the thing you're actually pointing at, very bright light can still hit imperfections in the lens aperture and the camera assembly and scatter. When it scatters, it will go outside of where it's actually supposed to be exposing the film because the lens is not perfect curvature. There might be particles in it that will deflect the photons. There might be just imperfections in its radius, right? And all of those things combine to scatter a little bit of light outside of the actual place that the light is supposed to be focused, even when something is in focus. What that means is that very bright light sources will produce, you'll see some of that haloing, and that's what a bloom filter is meant to, basically simulate, right? So while not really appropriate in a way because it's not real, it doesn't really exist. It's something that only happens when you take a picture of something. It's not really there in the real world, right? It's a way that we currently now have it's a semantic thing that we have accepted in our brains from watching movies and looking at photographs in our lives, that we know that something is bright if it has that halo around it. We've now internalized that as a grammar for this thing is bright. And so what we're really doing when we introduce a filter like that in a video game that isn't photorealistic, right? That's not doing all those other things. What we're doing is borrowing a shorthand mentally that humans have now grown up to understand because of their exposure to mass media, is just saying this is very bright. And so when you light these up, right, right now they don't look as bright as they should because we don't have any other of those signals in there. And so eventually what I'd like to do is put those signals in. So a bloom filter would be nice to add. And the other thing that would be nice to add would be some participating media, which means some dust in here, right? So that you will see the light. So basically some particles. So that's the thing. I said there's two things I might do today. That's the thing I think I'm going to delay till later. The main reason for that is that I don't really think I need it anytime soon. It's just going to sell these scenes a lot better, but it's not actually going to change anything material about what I'm doing, right? So I think we can safely postpone that. The lighting looks great currently. And I really have no need for anything better for most of the development of this game. So I think I can safely postpone those two features, even though they are going to be pretty important to making the game look cool, and should happen, right? So the thing I'd like to focus on today is just building some basic interactions here. This is what happens currently if you try to do anything in Handmade Hero. You get wedged between some enemies, and because we don't actually have any combat mechanics in there, I can't kill them and they can't kill me. So we don't really have a way to particularly do anything play-wise in the game, right? And similarly, we'd like to work on the hopping mechanics. We have these pressure plates so we proved that we can put those in there. But they don't actually work right, and also they're kind of buggy. You can keep pressing them down further and further, and they go right into the earth, right? So we definitely have a bunch of work that we would want to do here, and so what I think we might do for a little while is just go clean up some of this code, put a little bit of like combat stuff in there, clean up the glove. I haven't thought hard about how we want, like the glove is just on this like physics spring right here, and I need to think about how I want the glove to work or like what it's supposed to do. This is largely game design stuff. So it's not really something that I'm going to be talking much about or pretending that we actually are going to really solve. It's more just like me putting in something that's vaguely okay, right? And I'm just going to assume that those of you out there who are game designers would, if you were working on your own Handmade Hero code base, I'm just going to assume that you're going to go ahead and do something more intelligent here than whatever it is that I'm going to do. But that's your problem, and if you have a problem with it, go talk to Jonathan Blower, somebody who knows game design. I don't want to hear about it because it's not my job. So basically, like I said, everything looks good to me. I'm really liking moving around in this world, so I think it's good enough now that I'm happy to just say, I'll just go like make a world that I can walk around in, and I can do some stuff in, and there's a bunch of code that I have to write to support that anyway, because we decided to do basically just keeping everything in flat 2D, like it is now, without things stacked on top of each other. So I would also like to, you know, I'd like to go ahead and make something where I can, you know, hop into like a dungeon, to go like down dungeon levels, right? Sort of like, you know, like just, I don't know. I mean, basically what I'm saying is I'm going to start just doing some random stuff here to try and build out the world, because I don't really know what we're going to do there exactly. And I just want to start to just like polish that stuff up, because now things look pretty good and I would like to sort of like have some experiences in the world because it looks cool. And also generate some art asset lists, because we also, you know, at some point we'll need some more art for the game. And without knowing what's going on, there's really not a lot of ways for us to request art assets, because we don't know what art assets we would actually need. Furthermore, we can also do stuff like we actually have the ability to talk to NPCs and stuff now, but there's no reason to talk to NPCs and no reason for them to tell you anything or to do anything with them. And so again, we have a lot more features in this engine that than we are using. And so at this point, it just seems like logical to build that out. Again, why hasn't that already been done? Because I'm not a game designer and don't really know what to do. So I don't have, you know, one of the things that you'll see if you watch John stream or something, or someone who is a great game designer, there aren't very many of them, but, you know, John at least streams and he's very good. He has ideas about what's going to happen there, right? Like one of the things that drives him forwards when he's working on things is not the technical excellence of the thing that he's working on, but rather like some end goal that is a game design goal that he has, right? And that's very valuable when you're working on games. If you're working on them as a sole practitioner, that's extremely valuable, and what you would love to have if you were such a person. I don't really have to do this in my day-to-day life, thankfully, most of the time. But like on Handmade Hero, I'm in the unfortunate position of having to do it. What you would like there, like I said, is some strong idea. I mean, you know, I'm able to do this for code. Like I have a strong idea of like what I want to accomplish code-wise when I'm working on technical things. And I think what you want to have, right, if you're a game designer, is you want to have that strong motivation of what you're trying to move towards, right? Because it's the same, you know, it's the same with game design as it is with technology, and so, you know, I'm at a disadvantage there. But what I'm not at a disadvantage as is just wanting to, like, do basic stuff in the world and move around it. So what I'm going to do is basically just let that guide me, like, what I want to see in here just as an experience, I'm just going to make, and I'm just going to assume that the game itself will not be particularly good because I don't really have that kind of a skill set. But we can make an interesting world, and we can make like some interesting experiences in it, again, and just kind of let that drive us. So the biggest thing that I would say just to start with is I'd like to sort of work on the glove stuff a little bit, and maybe like you know, I'd like to figure out how I want this thing to feel. And you can see with what's in there currently, I did a little bit of work on this. So right now, you can kind of see if you hop around the world. We did this a long time ago. It was just kind of like basic control stuff when we put it in. The idea basically behind this quote-unquote game design is that if you had a bunch of tiles in the world, not probably like the ones here, because these are just randomly generated as a test, but if you had a certain pattern that you had to like do in order to open the doors to in the room that you're in, so maybe like you hop into the room and the doors close. Like I said, very standard Legend of Zelda, Binding of Isaac. It's just a trope at this point. It's a very standard game design thing that you go into a dungeon room and the doors close. And in order to open the doors again, you have to hop on a series of tiles. That's just the central conceit of the game. It's very simple. It shouldn't be that complicated to produce something reasonable there, right? And so one of the things that I wanted to do was make it so that when you hop, that's very important. That's why this game is grid-based and that you hop, is because it's important where you're hopping. Now, when you hop and you land on something, what I would like to do is I would like to make it so that you can also potentially dodge. And so one of the things you can do right currently is you hit the space bar and then you can still push in a direction. You can see that represented by the movement of the head here, right? And I don't really, again, super know exactly how I want that to work, but that's like part of it. So you come on here like I can dodge, and we'll have to make it so that you move more than this, right? That's not enough of a dodge, right? And you can see the glove is just this weird, stupid spring, and I don't really like that. I had thought maybe there'd be some interesting things with that, but the more I see it, the more I think, it's out of place in this game, a little bit. Maybe what I really want is the glove to be very procedural, so that you push, you push a strike, and it does that strike, and that's it, right? And again, I don't really know. All these things I'm saying are just like not real thoughts. They're just kind of like, that's basically the idea. So the glove originally was more of a procedural thing, and I wonder if that's more what we want here. I don't know that this game really wants any dynamic stuff in it like that. We may just want everything to be based on the fact that you are going to be standing on squares and stepping on squares, and maybe when you strike, like the strike pattern just, one way to think about the way that strikes work is to make them to be very concrete. And so, for example, one way that this might be concrete is saying, look, it could be that a glove has a particular attack pattern. And of course, there can be glove upgrades and downgrades and things like that in the game that you find was kind of expected to be something that would happen. And so if you took, for example, a glove strike pattern, and the glove strike pattern is like it goes out, there comes over here, back, and then in, right? Like it's like that kind of a thing. It could be that like, that pattern is fixed. So when you do a strike, the glove does that pattern and returns. And the reason that that's sort of interesting to me is because if the game is sort of about these geometries that are formed by tiles in the world, then different glove patterns would have different ways that you had to approach different rooms in the game, right? And different enemies would be harder or easier for different glove patterns and things like that, right? And so I don't really know at the end of the day that I want it to be really, like, the reason that I think it's kind of interesting to be able to manipulate the glove like I'm doing now, where it can kind of go in these sort of fanciful, dynamic physics-based patterns. I just don't know that that makes any sense in this game. One way to look at that would be to say that it does make a lot of sense in this game because the game is going to be about movement being very discrete, but punching being very fluid and physics-based. That's totally valid. I don't know that there's any way you could argue that that was, like, arbitrarily wrong. But I question whether that's the game that I would want to be making. Like thinking about it, I don't know that that is what I really want. Um, because I feel like what I want is more something that's more about those tiles. That's more akin to like a tactics game that's just it's not a tactics game, right? But it has a little bit of that sort of I understand what's going on because I can see where the tiles are kind of feel. So my sense is that like that might be more what I want to see happen. And so, it could be that really like we just don't have like one thing that I might one thing that I think could be a valid path forward in this game and maybe is just good enough for now because, I don't know how to do anything particularly smart here. One thing that might be a good path forward is just to say, okay, what's going to happen here is everything is about tiles always. So there's no such thing like these heads can't float like they're floating here. They have to move along actual grid things. There won't be projectiles that can go like diagonally. Projectiles are only horizontal and vertical, right? And that is both limiting, meaning that okay, so that cuts out a bunch of possibilities, but it it makes a space for design that guarantees that we'll be exploring something sort of interesting and unique, right? Because rather than just always falling back to the same things that you would normally see in this kind of game, like just projectiles and other stuff, we would be forcing ourselves to look specifically at a subset of game design that's about cardinal directions. And that at least seems more interesting so that maybe we would compensate for our lack of design skill by at least being in a space that's not maybe as well tread. So we might come up with a few things that are interesting that aren't just totally trite, that aren't just totally the same as everyone else, right? So that's kind of my thinking. Like maybe that's just how that is, and so that we just don't have like we just don't have things that are like we almost just don't have a collision system. The collision system is entirely transactional, right? It's always about tiles, and so when you resolve collisions, the collisions are on tiles and only on tiles, right? And to me, that just seems like the smartest way to go. Like at some point, especially if you're weak at game design, I think at some point you just have to pick something and say this is what the game is. Because if you're not super skilled at game design, you can't give yourself a complete freedom, because freedom is too difficult, like for unskilled people, right? You need to if you don't have game, it's the same in programming, right? If you're an expert programmer, you can give yourself complete freedom to do whatever you want because you will quickly be able to identify the proper set of constraints based on the problem that you're trying to solve because you're really good, right? And you just know how to make those decisions. But if you're not a very good programmer, giving yourself complete freedom is a disaster because you just spiral out of control and make all this stuff and you get nowhere, right? And so based on your skill level, I think you need to be willing to like narrow in and give yourself artificial constraints that you don't know if they were even the right constraints. And the reason for that is just because like you need to be able to finish the thing and it's too hard a problem without the constraints for you to be able to solve, right? You've given yourself a problem that is outside of your ability space, and you need those constraints to give you an easier problem. And like in this case, I'm saying up front, it probably won't therefore be the best game design you could have done with this game, but we already knew that was true because of our skill level. So I think that I guess I'm willing to just go ahead and say, let's just do it this way, because I know you could make a good game that way. Like, I'm sure John could make a good game with these constraints. So I don't think we're designing ourselves out of a good game by making them. And by picking them arbitrarily, it's sort of saying, look, this is just going to be, we're putting training wheels on this design because that's how good we are at riding a bike, right? Sure, we'd love to ride a 10-speed, you know? But if you can't even stay on the bike, like, what are you doing on it? Why are you trying to, like, do the Tour de France? Right? So I think that's what I'll say is, like, look, we're just not going to do that. Entities are going to have move patterns, and we're just going to say that, like, we'll make the best game design we can within those constraints, but those are the constraints. There's no other options that you get. So figure out how to make the best game design you can, given the constraint that everything has to be a transactional movement, exactly like it would normally be in a tactics game. However, unlike a regular tactics game, this game happens in real time. So it's kind of like borrowing the ideas from a tactics game about tiles, but not actually having any, like, you know, not actually having the turn-based nature. You can still move around and do things as fast as you can figure out how to do them, and the enemies will as well, and that's how that goes. So I think what that means is, like, effectively we have sort of this move entity call, right? And basically what we want to do is we looked at this, and this was going to be a bunch of work that we would have to do too to, like, finish up collision detection. We had some in there, but it wasn't as good as it should be. Again, it reduces the work for us. We already did the work of having a transactional movement system. And so by removing this, we would also save ourselves some time, because now we don't have to go down this rat hole of how do we want to handle our collision and how do we get that up to a particularly good level. So what we could do is say, all right, let's just remove this stuff entirely. And then we don't have to do, you know, the movement displacement or any of this stuff, right? We would just have transactional occupy, and we will have to, like, improve that system a little bit, because right now it's we need to get, like, the edge transitions working correctly. I've done a lot of programming on these kind of systems before, and just to give you a little bit of a perspective on it, when we look at the edge transitions here, there's, like, transactional occupy is basically saying, okay, if we were doing a move-based game, like a tactics game like you would normally do, what would happen on the move when entity X makes this move, right? But in this, it's not going to be a tactics game. It's going to be a real-time game. And so we have this notion of a movement edges. What that means is, for example, let's suppose we already see, in fact, let me just show you, because I don't have to tell you, we've already got it. Watch very carefully what happens. In fact, I'll help you. You don't even have to watch very carefully, because we have a time step adjustment here. Let me set it down to 1/10 speed. Watch what happens when I hop from this square onto the tile. Do you notice how it lit up immediately? Which is totally not what we want to see, right? It feels wrong. What was happening there? Well, what happens there is currently our system just all works on the leading edge of a transaction. When you decide that you're going to move from one square to another square, all of the events that would happen from you landing on that square happen. One of those events is that you will light up a floor switch, right? So we don't want that. We now, if we're going to go down this route, right, and we're saying everything's going to be transactional, we need to add, like, basically 3 stages, if you will, to the transactional system. It will still work basically like it currently does, but there needs to be a notion of a leading edge, a sustaining action, and then a trailing edge, kind of attack, sustain, and release, if you will, from music nomenclature. And what I mean by that is we have events that will take place at the leading edge. We will have events that take place during and events that will take place at the trailing edge. For the example of someone hopping onto a switch, that is a trailing edge event, meaning even though the event is more or less going to be inevitable because we know that the hopper is going to land there, we don't want to trigger it until he actually lands. And furthermore, it's still not quite true that is inevitable because maybe this person, for example, gets shot, right? Like, suppose there is a projectile that comes to hit me, or maybe this is an enemy that's hopping on there. My glove, like, punches them in the middle of the sustain, then the trailing edge part wouldn't actually take place. So our system will be a little bit different than what you would think of when you normally think of a transactional movement game such as a tactics game, because unlike a tactics game where the move is a foregone conclusion when the initiator initiates it, and really the only concern you have is how do you wish to draw it, in our game we really will probably have basically the equivalent of like what Magic the Gathering, for example, calls an interrupt, where somebody can interrupt the flow of what's actually going to happen. We will be having that because it's going to be an action game. Which sounds great. I mean, to me, that just sounds interesting. So I think, again, I'm fine with this approach. I think it will yield reasonable game design results, right? So I'm going to get rid of this voxel stuff that's in here currently and the shape collision things that are there. And like the voxel stack stuff, like we don't really need that anymore, I don't believe. And so we're just going to get rid of it. I believe like we've got just a bunch of, like all of this stuff we just don't really need anymore. And also this align to movement voxel, I don't think we need either. So we can eliminate a bunch of code, and that at least is good from a technical standpoint because it means that, again, we're reducing the workload and reducing the variability, the sort of like degree that we have to bulletproof this stuff, and so hopefully this is like a plus in that respect, right? I think that's all of it, right? And so all we would really be doing here for the most part is for starting, we would just say, look, there's no such thing as a floating entity. That just cuts out that entire movement mode. Now, these movement modes are kind of stupid, and we probably now want to clean those up and regularize them now that we know what's going on, but really that was it, right? So that's all it takes to remove that code from the game, and now we can see that like the glove and also like the floating heads are now basically just dead in the water because they're set to have that floating movement mode, which we've now said doesn't exist. So they need to now have some code for how they're actually going to move, but otherwise this isn't, there's no real magic to it, right? It's not rocket surgery. So let's take a look at, like this stuff, right? This stuff is where we're going to be living for a little while, right? We kind of need like some ideas about what's supposed to happen here, and we're going to need some we're going to need to like basically redo this whole thing, like how we're conceptualizing of like the glove and that sort of stuff. Now, there are some issues here, like, I mean, I guess one thing we could say is any of this stuff really what we want? So if you look at how this stuff is working, right, you've got this idea of this movement mode. And I think maybe what we're sort of going to say is, look, there's like no such thing as a movement mode anymore. There's just tile-to-tile movement, right? So really these are animations. Like that's really all we're talking about here is like, how do I animate the fact that you're moving? You know what I mean? And so it may be the case that really what we can do is spread. is sort of break this up into just an animation of how you move from one tile to another, which is sort of what these actually are now. I think these got removed, by the way. Let me put this back in for just one quick second and see, because I think these are not actual things anymore. Yeah. So yeah, when I look at that, that's what I'm thinking, right? So in my head, what I would want to say is this is more like we will still want these codes for the animation mode. Like, look, what kind of animation is this thing playing? Basically, we have pretty much just procedural animation in this game, and so when you see somebody says, I'm hopping from this square to this square, that's going to be like a particular animation that's being played. That's more like what this enum is, right? So it's not a movement mode, it's an animation. It's just entity animation. That's all it's going to really be. And then movement will no longer have a mode associated with it at all. There's just, you're going from this tile to this tile, that's it. And some entities will go from one tile to the next tile, meaning like we move directly. They can only go to tiles next to them, is what I'm trying to say poorly. Other entities that maybe hop big jumps could go differently. Like, think of a knight on a chessboard. Maybe they can go, with a big hop, sort of from one place to another without touching the tiles in between, right? So there's going to be sort of like, there's going to be two ideas there, right? One is just, here's the cells that I'm going to touch, here's the squares I'm going to touch. That now can just, I think, be regularized. There's just basically like, this is the sequence of squares I'm going to hit, right? And everyone can share that same code because it's literally just the like transactional thing, and that's it, right? Then this is just the animation style. If you want to see a hop, right? Because this is a hopping entity, then it sets the animation to hop when it hops, right? If you want to see it just float along, then it sets it to float, right? So this becomes not a movement mode, but rather just a, it's just an animation trigger. Just like you would in any other game normally, you'd just be loading like an animation off disk. In this case, we don't have animations off disk, but we have like procedural stuff. So really all we're doing is like picking what that procedural animation is, right? And that to me seems like very sane. So, I think we can just kind of go forwards with that and say like, maybe let's start by renaming this so it's a little clearer. And we just say, this is entity animation. And we have like animation planted, right? Animation hopping and animation floating. And so we just preserve. Nice. We just preserve what we have right now, but we're going to name it something else and move it kind of into a different place in the code kind of conceptually, so that now we know that all this is doing is driving like that, the visual of it. But it has no, like, what you set this to will have literally no bearing on the game at all, right? Like, it's literally just going to be about what you see when you look at the game, right? I apologize for the allergies. And then the movement will be totally different. So we won't have, like we're not going to have like any of this stuff or any of that stuff. The movement's just going to be a list of cells and the transition speeds that you go through. So basically like, how long does it take you to begin your transition, how long does it take to transition, and then how long does it take to end, right? So basically those like edges that I was talking about, like starting hopping, and then finishing hopping or whatever, right? Okay, so if we go ahead and start changing these up, and we just basically go through and change movement mode here to animation. In fact, we could change the literal word movement mode. And now I just go through and change that. So I think we can do like a replace. I don't remember how to do a replace. I basically never do a replace. Is there a replace? Query replace, I guess. Replace in all buffers. Movement mode with animation. And I think that's really all we did. Yeah. So I replaced that, and now it's called animation. And so now what we would want to do is go through and sort of separate out those two pieces, right? And if you remember, which you don't, I mean, who am I kidding? If you remember, when we are doing like update and render entities, there's basically like this code that does that sort of breakout. Not the video game breakout, but basically like this animation loop, so you can see it right in there. This right here is sort of the thing that handles like how something is supposed to animate, right? And what I'd like to do here is I would like to make the animation be something that's just driven off of a t variable, which it currently is, that's controllable directly by the game, and that just the transactional movement system will just drive that t variable, right? And so I'd like to basically move this out. I don't remember that. I guess you can stomp the enemy. I do remember vaguely adding that. I should change internal to function one of these days. I now just type function there. Like, I now just use that. There are reasons why that's not as good, but, mainly the reason is because it's actually a pragma for Visual Studio to define like intrinsics like memset. So, So if I want to have this animation stuff, now that we kind of know that it, or not know, but I believe I sort of know how it's going to break down a little bit better here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the animation stuff. You can actually see, like, yeah, there's a bunch of things about this, but if I just go ahead and grab this animation stuff here and grab it out to here in this sort of separated function, what I'm going to do is now just have like an idea, a place here where we say how this stuff is supposed to go, and we'll probably not do this anymore. So what you can see is the way that this is the way that this code is written is it effectively assumes, you can see a lot of stuff that's happening here, right? But what you can see is that this animation stuff is basically structured so that the animation itself controls how fast like this is actually occurring. Sorry, there was a question from a simulator right now, and I just want to see, could you please at some point explain what internal, external function and static? Sure, yes, I can. So this is what is the actual C code. Internal or function is just a pound defined to be static, The reason for that is that static itself is used in multiple places, and it can mean very different things. So here are the 3 ways you can have static. One is in front of a global variable, one is in front of a function, and one is inside a function. The primary reason for pound defining static to something else is I don't ever like to type it in, because it does not let me search conveniently for this usage, specifically this one. This usage is generally you should never use for any reason. This is a usage which says that this value persists inside this function as a persistent value when you are inside the function, right? And it persists to the next call of the function as well, right? It's a global variable, but that's local to this function. These are extremely dangerous, and they're dangerous for a number of reasons. The first reason they're extremely dangerous is because the definition of the C spec and C++ specs is full banana cakes and says that this variable will not actually get initialized until you call the function. The reason that's full banana cakes is that because it means that depending on what the compiler that you're using happens to decide to do, it might introduce code that's completely nuts and bad to guarantee that that happens, and you end up in a situation where you have weird multi-threaded race conditions about who updates who starts the initialization of the variable, or you add extra code to prevent that because the compiler's adding code to make sure that that works properly, and that code is bad or like slow, or at the very least locks up your threads. Similarly, once you have it here, if you're calling this from multiple threads, now you don't really have any guarantee that this line of code, for example, in here, what's going to happen. It's not going to yield an atomic, so it means that your increments of this variable are wrong if multiple threads call the function. So this is a very bad thing to have happen, and you really don't ever want to do it unless you were very, very intentional about it, and you'd want to know everywhere in your code that did it. So the goal of pound defining static is to make sure that you no longer use it, and you use something like this, which is our pound define for static that we would use in this scenario so that we could search for it anywhere that it actually happens, right? Now, why do we need to put static in front of either of these? Because otherwise you really wouldn't need to, right? I mean, what's the difference between that and that? Like, for our purposes, very little, right? Well, the answer is that when you are compiling something, the C and C++ spec, again, being bad, they have really bad problems with linking. Most programs take forever to link. If you were to look at something like the Unreal Engine or, you know, some large code base, like LLVM or something like this, they have massive link times. Like, it takes forever to link. And a lot of the work that's being done is in exporting a crap ton of symbol names out from the compilation process to the linker, gathering those up in the linker, merging comdats, like doing stuff like link time code generation or you know, inlining, and just processing all of this garbage. It's a complete waste of everyone's time. None of it should have happened. It's just because the spec is bad and continues to be bad, and nobody really knows what they're doing, so it never gets fixed. As a result, putting static in front of these is a fast way to tell the compiler not to export any of these symbols. Because we use a single translation unit build for the most part, it means that we don't need to export basically any of our symbols. So we can quickly alleviate that burden on the compiler of producing the symbol table that it's going to export to a linker, because we can tell it that we're not exporting anything to a linker, right? And so it just helps keep compile times down by ensuring that you don't actually have this problem, if that makes sense. So really all of this stuff is just to make sure that all that stuff goes well. And really it's all about managing arbitrary compiler stuff, because just the history of C and C++ is such that you should never, ever trust the compiler, you can never trust the people who write the spec or the compiler, ever. Even if they happen to be doing something okay now, they probably will screw it up next time, right? So really what you're trying to do is just make sure that you are in a position to work around whatever latest garbage they end up doing, right? So that's what we do here, and again, it's just to make sure that we're doing the best possible thing that we can to try and help the compiler know that it doesn't need to send anything to the linker. So, Martins, what does C++ 11 and up do with multiple threads that go into a static variable? Like, what do they do? What did they spec would happen now? I shudder to ask. Yeah, but putting locks around it's terrible, right? Or that like just put in locks into your code that you don't know what kind of locks they even were, right? I mean, that's kind of what I was saying. Like, it's really bad if they put locks in there. Well, it works in one sense, but it doesn't work in another sense, right? Like, again, describing something as working it's not really true. Just because it produces the correct result, if part of the thing was how fast this thing was supposed to run or whether it would have any weird behaviors, having locks suddenly in there is not, what you would want. That said, it's not impossible for it to do a reasonable thing, because since you can just do a check that doesn't take a lock first and only take the lock if the check fails, then it's unlikely to be particularly bad. But still, it's just, in general, you should never have anything that has anything to do with threads happen that you don't control. It's just a bad idea. And so I would still stand by my original statement of, like, you don't ever do that. If you want those things, you should write them yourself so that you know what was happening and when. So, let me go ahead and I always imagine local static variables as being the same as global static lifetime-wise. Only difference is the variables only available. Yeah, that's not how it works. So it's basically like it says that it won't actually get initialized until you enter the function, I believe. Or at least that's how it was. So it's not quite the same, right? It introduces code that wouldn't ordinarily be there. It's not automatically hoisted, right? Meaning it's not the same. That is not the same as that, even if X is only used inside this function. Because of the fact that, I don't know why. That's how I would have defined it, right? I think it's because in C++ they want you to be able to do this. Right? I mean, technically it'd be that, right? They want you to be able to do this, and they want this to only be called when you get here, so that this thing that does like 17,000 things in the middle of its constructor, it has to be like only happen when you go in there. It's all stupid, it doesn't matter. Here's what I'll say. Don't use statics inside functions is the best rule of thumb. You never need them for anything. So I sometimes throw them in there for debugging purposes, like if I'm doing something quickly, and that's totally fine. Other than that, just stay away from them. You never need them for anything. There's no point to them. Just make a global variable if you need it. That's it. It doesn't do anything. It just causes problems. So I would just stay away from it. It's fine, right? So, yeah, and Martins, that's what I would that's what should have probably been the definition of this thing. Like, they probably should have only had that, where it's just a scoped global variable that can't really call any stuff. And if it does call stuff, it happens at startup. That's how I would have done it. I wouldn't have done what they did. I know why they did it that way, but as usual, I think they don't really know what they're doing. All right, so let's go ahead and finish up what we were working on here. So we need to pass in a sim region so that we can do queries. That's probably true in general, I would say. So I don't know that I need to remove that. Maybe we should. I don't know. Oh, stomp on entity is... So we actually preserved even the call to stomp on entity. We just don't let you stomp on an entity yet. I mean, because you can't really stomp on an entity because you're not allowed to hop into a square that has an entity in it. But I guess maybe that was the thing. That's kind of cool. I mean, that's really kind of neat. So hey, maybe that's going to be a thing. Like, I don't know. It doesn't matter at the moment, but that's kind of neat. I do like that. I don't think we really want this bit here, but like we do probably want this to happen, but I don't think we would want to actually like have to call fill unpacked entity at this particular time. So I don't know about that. That's probably a bit of a bridge too far. So I'm going to go ahead and say that we don't probably pass assets there. It seems like that's maybe a bit far-fetched, but we'll see. So anyway, the same is kind of true of particle cache. Like that part's a little bit strange. I don't know. Like spawning particles, like I don't know to what extent we want those to happen here. Maybe we do. Because this is animation, and that's what particles are. So, you know, yeah. So, yeah, what I was trying to say before is basically this idea of, like, T movement. I think that wants to be outside. Because I think animations just want to be driven off of the T value, and I don't think they should ever actually have, you know, even this, yeah, like, this is not really in the right place. You can just see it. This is not, you know, it should just be basically about this edge transition that's happening here. And we want that to kind of be handled outside in like the closing edge of what's happening in this particular entity. So that's, yeah, we're kind of going to have to like think through how we want that to happen. And so, yeah, I mean, we'll get there. It's going to be a little bit of a reorganization as we kind of go through and figure out how we want all these things to sort of weave together. But for the most part, it's like, you know, we're just trying to make it so that these things make reasonable sense as they, you know, as animation versus event. We would rather separate the animations and events a little bit. Again, to make it easier on ourselves to write sort of the animations and use them more broadly across many different circumstances that might have different events happening, and that sort of thing. Okay. So... I gotta stretch it out as far as I can stretch. Okay. KWMR, like, that's really bad if that's what they're doing. If local static variables use thread local storage to execute, that's like terrible, right? Thread local storage is like very slow. It's like a double indirect lookup. First, you have to look up the GS segment value for the table, and then you have to look up the index off of that table. So like you would never ever want to use thread local storage for anything that you don't absolutely have to, right? So like if that's actually how they implemented it, that sounds terrible. So that would be yet another reason not to use static variables if that's really how it's being done, because that's a terrible, terrible idea, in my opinion. Just absolutely horrible. All right. So if we look up this update animation, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, all right, so if the animation hopping stuff, like you can see, like we could just say, oh, well, so there's the animation floating stuff, and maybe we just do exactly the same thing. So we just say like, all right, if there's a to and a from place that we're going here, then all we really have to do is just do the movement to and the movement from. It's just floating, so it's just a linear interpolation or whatever, right? And maybe we want like, you know, some better stuff than that in the future, but for now we don't really care till we look a little bit more closely at like what we want to do. You know what I mean? So here we could just say clamp 01. And just use the t movement variable to move us, you know, float us between the places that we're going. Just, you know, not in a particularly interesting way or anything. And now we just need these. Oops. Now we just need these guys as like these guys could now move, I think. Well, no, that's not quite true. So we need to regularize this a little bit more. But what I was going to say is now these guys could move as long as we go to the brain controller and just say, okay, the brain now picks like somewhere for them to go. Right? So yeah, so really, oh boy. There's so much stuff to do here. I mean, it's like, yeah, I mean, we just really haven't spent any time on this code, and just there's so many things we can do, and we should probably just start doing them all because they're all kind of interesting and game-like. So, you like the floating head things wouldn't step on buttons, right? And so if we basically have the button stepping code be in here, yeah, I mean, right. There's just so much stuff we can do now. So let's start to try and work through this slowly. We have a tremendous amount of stuff. What time do I have to start my dinner stuff? I got at least an hour of programming I can do here. So anyway, looking at what's going on here, let's ignore the glove for now because that's kind of a new thing. Let's just look at the whatever those floating head things are called. I don't actually know what they're called. I think they might be one of these. I mean, they're not the familiar anymore, but I think that is what they're doing. Yeah, and so these... Whew, boy. There's so much cleanup to do here, right? You can still swap your head with ground tiles. Yeah, you can swap your head with... What did we do? There was something that we did that was just a joke that you could swap your head with. What even was that? I know what you're talking about. There's like a whole... We added a thing where you could hit a button and swap your head out with something. Do you guys even remember? I don't remember anything about that other than like that we did it. It was with the enemy, but I don't. What was? Do you just hit return? I don't even remember like what you hit, but yeah, there was something like that. There we go. Basically any nearby entity that's not a static tile, you can just grab as the head. Can you get a tree? Probably not, because that's not an entity. You maybe, can you get like an orphan? So you can't get an orphan. So I don't know what our check was. Our check must have been something like that prevented you from getting a, like I can't get a cat head, which seems ridiculous. If you're going to have this feature, you should be able to get a cat head, right? I mean, do we want to target the furry demographic or don't we here, dude? You should be able to get a cat head on. So yeah, I don't know what we're actually checking for. I don't even know. I don't know what this code is doing. I have no idea. So that code will just be removed though. Like that's not gonna stay in, right? I don't even know what we put that in for. It was just something for fun, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what the heck we were doing. Yeah, so like basically I grabbed that thing. I can grab the other thing too, looks like. Like now I've got like a rib cage as my head, which doesn't seem particularly good. So anyway, I don't know what the heck that code is for. It's funny. I guess there's that. But I don't know that it's particularly good. Thank you for opening the door for us. That was very nice of it. Oh, I'm also now lighting up the world because these guys have a light attached to them. I forgot about that. Yeah. Enough subs for actually. No, there's only 766 subscribers. I said I wouldn't do a React stream unless there were 2,000 subscribers. There's no way that we'll ever have that many subscribers by design. I picked a number we will never have so that there's no chance I have to do a React.js stream. So don't even think about it. It's impossible. It was picked to be impossible. Yeah, so I guess that code must just like pick. It must just pick like the closest thing. Gosh, I don't even know. Like the closest thing that that is a head, that is marked as a head, but those ground tiles wouldn't be. So it looks like you can swap it with anything that has a brain. Right? So it looks like as long as the thing has a brain, you can swap with it. I guess the reason you can't swap with the NPCs is right now they just don't have a brain assigned. So, yeah, I don't know. I would assume that probably we just want to turn this off. It's not really something that should be happening, right? So we'll nerf that from now. But who knows if it will come back, right? So now you can't grab arbitrary crap. All right, so what I was trying to say before is just that, like, we now have to start thinking how we're going to do the actual movement transactions, and we want those movement transactions to have like more consistency, more logic to them. And so let's start trying to make this happen. So effectively, any given entity is going to have a movement operation that they're currently doing, and that movement operation is going to have some rules to it, right? And there's also like kind of there's some kind of interesting questions here too about like what do we actually want, how do we want to represent things like a glove strike that happens across multiple squares? Do we want to just have that be a movement that like basically queues up like here are the squares that are going to be you know I need to think about this for a second. Because like if we want this thing to be about like patterns like that, then I do wonder if you want to do things like when you hit the strike, when you do something like execute a punch, what it's really saying is we're going to cue this pattern, right, of cell to cell movements. And the same would be true for like enemy attacks. And like once you commit to one of them, it like has to follow through, right? And like maybe there are ways for you to interrupt that sometimes, and maybe there are times when it cannot be interrupted, right? Like maybe sometimes, maybe certain glove attacks, if it turns out that the attack, if like the attack is fairly lengthy, like it spans 9 cells that it does or something, maybe like certain kinds of attacks you can interrupt in the middle if they're going poorly and you want to recall the glove to do something. Maybe you can do that, and maybe other times you can't, and so it's like a big deal. Like if this glove is an interruptible glove, that's like potentially like a big deal because it means that you can start an attack and then not finish it if it turns out to be going poorly. Whereas other gloves, maybe, and there's like trade-offs, like, oh, there's a more powerful glove, but it cannot be interrupted. So once you start an attack, that attack will go through. I kind of like the sound of that. So I feel like maybe what we do is we say like there's like a move queue where, there's like this move that you've queued up and it's getting executed and it sort of has properties that are gameplay related, right? Like to me that sounds good. And so I'm just going to maybe do that because I don't see a reason not to. So like maybe what we do is basically say, look, you queue up, you create a queue of tiles that will get occupied by this thing, or it will attempt to occupy these squares. And then the system just tries to do that, and they are marked as whether or not you may or may not be able to like interrupt them. I guess my only question now is where does that live? Do we have a move queue that's basically separate from entities? So like moves go into the move queue and they are generally dealt with um tin spin, yes, of course you can. Um I mean, you can make a thing that runs on XP and Windows 10 if you want to. Um, just make sure you don't link with anything from Windows 10 that isn't in Windows XP, and anything that you want to use in Windows 10, you do a get proc address, load library get proc address, and only use if you find it, right? That's how you would do it. Um, So yeah, my feeling on this is like I think this all sounds good. My only question is where does that move queue go? And there's two ways you could do it. One way is each entity keeps its own move queue. I think that's kind of wasteful because most entities in the system don't move. Like they're like ground tiles that don't move. So that seems stupid. So what I would say is probably there's sort of this separate idea of move queues. The move queue, there's just, some bunch of 64 move queues or whatever, like the brains. The brains hold the move queues or whatever, and so brains have the move queues in them, and you only get assigned a move queue if you actually have an active thing at that time, right? So my guess is it's more like, there's this brain thing, and these brains, if I remember correctly, the brains kind of like they get assembled like over time, right? Like they get assembled as you start a particular simulation. You basically get like a brain slot assigned to anybody who's doing, active stuff, which is the only people who would need a move queue anyway, because if you don't have an AI attached to you, how you wouldn't know to move anyway. So I'm assuming that would be fairly safe. And so if you look at the sim region, I believe what happens is that inside the sim region itself, why can I not jump to sim region? I hate the way this works. I wish that someone would fix it. I can probably try to fix it myself, but like, why would you ever want to jump? Like, this thing needs to say which one is which, right? Like, it needs to say whether this is the forward declaration of a type or the actual type, and it should severely pessimize the forward declaration because you basically never want to go there, right? It don't make no sense. Yeah, it's just really inefficient. Anyway, so the sim region here, what we have is this entity hash and brain hash that get built up. And I believe that the only place that brains ever actually exist is like in here. You know what I'm saying? Therefore, like the problem that we would have is you can't store these move queues anywhere because they don't really exist. There's nothing that persists from frame to frame, right? Which is kind of not super useful. So, like, the question is, like, where do you want that stuff to live? And, of course, like, it can live in the entity, like we said. But it just seems wasteful to put in the entity. I mean, I guess we could put it in the entity and say, well, the entities are going to get compressed anyway. and that stuff gets thrown out when the entity is packed. So as long as it stays unpacked, it's in the active set and would need the move queue. If it gets packed, then it's not going to move anyway. So it doesn't need its move queue anymore. I mean, that's a thing, you could say. But what I would really prefer is just a coherent notion of a move queue that just exists over time. It's pretty hard to know, though. Like, the Handmade Hero code does this nice thing where, like, you can basically have worlds be as large as you want, which almost nothing ever supports. And so one of the downsides of doing something like that is you would have to decide what happens to a move queue when you are not really simulating that part of the world. Presumably you just throw it out, right? And so that kind of suggests one of two things. Either the move queues are just in the entities, and then when they get packed, they just get tossed. I mean, you can't, right? So, so when you look at Handmade entity, right, you can see like there's this thing at the bottom which is just like crap that doesn't get stored. And so really, like, maybe that's just the answer to how most of this stuff works, and you just don't bother overthinking it, right? You just say, look, there's a move queue. The move queue is like where you're going to go, these entity traversal points, which at this point now we could actually get rid of these. So these are totally not necessary anymore because we basically are just on a grid now. You know what I mean? And so while we're on a grid, we don't need the flexibility of traversable points. We could just use the grid index, right? So the traversable points are not really interesting, and we can simplify this code tremendously, and probably should. But for now, let's just say that we're not going to do that. And so what we would say, I guess, is the traversable point ID. So this, right? There's just some like big old list of these. 32 is probably not something we would want. But so let maybe like 16 or whatever. But there's just a list of those, and anytime you're going to do a movement, you push it onto the queue, and that is what that is, right? And you know, if we were going to be the kind of people who do things that are things that you do when you're this kind of person, you might also say that there's like a move queue entry struct, and that has the traversable entry in it. That's like the destination. And then also like some crap in here. Like, is it interruptible? You know what I mean? So you'd have like these move queue entries. You say like, okay, are we allowed to interrupt this particular move or not? And then when you have like control input that comes in, you can look to see whether or not you're actually able to interrupt the thing. that you're currently doing, and if you can, then you clear the move queue and change the movement request. But like otherwise you just have to keep doing it, right? Yeah. So I don't know. I'm just gonna go ahead and say like that's fine, and maybe that's just what happens. Is John still streaming Counter-Strike, by the way? Does anybody know? No? It's over? Who won? Or is there only one match today? How does Counter-Strike work? How did the finals work? Do they are like is it multiple days of stuff or whatever? Multiple days of playoffs, final best of 3 today. So like are they going to play another match later on today? Or oh, okay. So it's already over and like phase 1 won the thing. I see. All right. Yeah, well, simulator. That thought had crossed my mind as well. So, back to our program. So if we add this move queue thing in here, also, what the heck does move spec do now? Nothing, right? So we should be able to get rid of that, and just like, you know, sort of squanch that away. And then we don't use introspection anymore, so I don't know why that's there. Let's get rid of all that. All right. Okay, back to our show. So what we want here is we want a way to, yeah, like, you know, okay. So, you know, you're doing this stuff and you're hopping around and all that good stuff. And I assume, although I don't really know, that pretty much what you would do here is when you don't like the glove needs to sort of not really occupy the squares that the glove moves through because it's not supposed to block motion in those squares, probably. Like, the glove is sort of like ethereal, right? So, like, again, this is really game design, unfortunately, but, you know, it is what it is. So, like, if we imagine what's got to happen here, like, this glove kind of has to be, like, just kind of floating next to the hero, sort of tucked in there, more or less. Probably. Like, it's too high up right now as well, and probably needs to be, like, right there, basically. Just sort of in there. And when you hop from one square to the other, the glove has to just be, like, wherever you are, and it can't really occupy these squares, which is probably fine. So, again, I apologize, but I'm really just trying to think this through for the first time, so I don't really know what's supposed to happen here. Like, I'm just kind of making this up, right? But for, you know, for the most part here, what we're talking about is when you do stuff in here and you hop from one place to another, this PDC nonsense has to be replaced with something that actually has an idea of where the heck this thing is going to go. Furthermore, entity DDP, like, wouldn't be a thing because all of the animation would have to be procedural. Now, like, maybe we would have a DDP in there somewhere for, like, matching visual consistency stuff. It's not like we would totally not have that, right? But in general, like, we would just be saying you move from one square to the other or whatever. So my guess is that what should happen here is that whenever you hop from one place to another, your glove should hop toward wherever you are at, right? So if we look at the glove, and we say, okay, if the glove move queue count equals 0, that means there's nothing that it's, like, trying to do right now. And so it can have the place where the hero currently is, we can just push that on as the place it's going to snap back to. And, like, in the future, we probably want that snapback to have to actually traverse. But for now, maybe I'll just have it go direct. For whatever reason, like, I don't know. I also don't know why this glove thing is inside the part where you have to have a head and a body, because it seems to me like that's not necessary. So I'm assuming that you could really just do, like, as long as there's a body and a glove, then you do something or something. So here you would say the glove, like, the glove place that it's trying to go, Yeah, all of this stuff would go away. God, there's so much cleanup we have to do now. The glove place that it's trying to go needs to be set here, basically. So if the move Q count is 0, then it would push one onto there. This is all nonsense. Okay. So I think we need to sort of fundamentally change a little bit of the stuff to put us in a position to be able to write this kind of code quickly and like the way that we want to do it, right? This code should look something like if the move Q count is 0, then if and I don't know, like maybe this is kind of like, well, no, I don't know. This stuff probably needs to be like more about how we execute the move Q. And honestly, that move Q might need more, like the actual move Q entry might be the thing that you put the animation type in, right? So we kind of have two separate issues here, and I don't really know. One of them's pretty straightforward. So what we'd want to do here is basically say, look, we put a move on the move queue. That's if the glove is not where the player is, then it moves to where the player is, right? The harder part is saying, what does that actually mean? Because the glove, in addition to moving, needs to know that it should be like relative to the player's position. So we also want to set like a relative to the square. Gosh, I don't know about that. The part about the glove, like where it should appear on the tile, is a little more complicated to me. But I guess maybe what you say there is that it is sort of, that is like a separate thing that happens with the facing direction or something. Do we have sound effects at the moment? Yes, but I think they may be turned off at the immediate moment. Like, if that's what you mean. Let me see. So, I'm pretty sure that there should be a sound in this play sound thing here. So, let me see if that's actually turned off at the moment, because it might be. We probably do want that to be on at the moment. Just because we're going to want to start like having that be in there, right? So this thing, output playing sounds, I don't know, like we may have basically like nerfed this somehow. I just don't remember, like, because, you know, when we were doing development before, we may have wanted to turn it off. You know, again, I really just don't remember like what we did there, but it looks like it's still hooked up. So get sound samples is still being called, right? And so I think all of this stuff should still be working. Now, the thing that I don't actually know is whether we actually have this baked in, this bloop sound, right? I don't actually know if that's actually being built. It looks like it is, right? There's a bloop wave file that, you know, maybe is in here. I assume it is. So we could look and see, like there's this play sound, right? So we could look and see if that's actually happening, but it looks like it should sort of be happening at least a little bit, right? So let me take a look and I can see if this is working or not, because I don't really know. So I'm going to set a breakpoint at play sound. So yeah, we call this function. It puts a sound onto the... It does like place a sound onto the list here, although that is not finding a sound. So I take it back. Like, basically this get best match asset, that is actually not working. So that's wrong. It may be that asset audio isn't a thing anymore. To be honest, it's like I guess that part I don't really remember. So it looks like sounds currently aren't playing because we no longer look them up. That's what it appears to be anyway. So in here, like this, that with tag bloop doesn't appear to actually find anything for whatever it's worth. We could look at the asset processor. Nope. So you can see here there's like this HHA asset sound that's coming in here, and, you know, when it processes this audio import, you get, well, I mean, you get whatever you get, and presumably the tags, on it are set okay. But it doesn't look like it finds it. So I'm not sure why we don't get a sound there. But that's why. So basically this right here that tries to find the sound effect never finds it. And that's why there's no sound at the moment. So if we go into this, this is the tag hash here, right? So here's like assets by tag, and it's like trying to look this up, and here's the asset values that it's looking through. And this type value here, if I add a watch to it, I can cast it to what it thinks it is. So that's a bitmap, so that's obviously not going to work, right? So basically, like, it's just not there. It's just not, the tag hash doesn't match. So the reason that this is not playing is because that was never added to the import, apparently. So if we look for in the NV system here, if we look for the way that we're getting these from other stuff, right? So I guess the better place to look probably would be in EntityGen. When you do the hashes, you can see like what sort of hashes look like. They're just like a thing and then the tag, right? You would think that that would be correct. So like asset body, base asset, or whatever is how those normally are. So presumably, that would work. Now, as I look at this, those are legacy categories supposedly, but you know, as I look at this, like the audio tag, right? I mean, that is what that should do. And then, you know, bloop is up here. So it looks to me like that should have worked, you know? And so that's why I said, like, I'm not really sure. The asset processor, when it processes an audio import and it goes to do, like, what are the tags on this thing, you can see it sort of doing that bit here. It sets the type to HHA asset sound, but I guess I don't know if it inserts a tag for that, right? So that's part might be more interesting. So let's look. Like, this is going to pass in the tags here, right? That it parsed out. So yeah, like, I do wonder. Maybe no one's ever actually passing that in. Like, it could be that. Like, there's that asset audio, right? That's in end tags. And that tag is going to be in the opposite order, right? So it looks like it would happen the same way, though. So I'm not sure why this works either. I guess maybe because tags go in the opposite order. But if you look and it's like, okay, it's going to add this basic category tag with whatever the category is. You would think that would work. So, I don't know. It looks, that code is terrible. Like, most of the asset system is absolutely horrible, right? But it honestly doesn't look like, as bad as it is, it doesn't look like it's really doing anything all that strange. So that's a bit confusing as to why that didn't work, right? So let's take a look here and see if maybe there's a little bit of a better explanation for that, because it doesn't really look like it's doing anything too stupid, but maybe it actually is. So you can see here, like, yeah, it would appear to be doing the thing for the basic category, right? Like, it doesn't seem like it's doing anything weird there. So you would think that that would probably work correctly. You know what I mean? It doesn't seem particularly strange, right? It doesn't seem particularly strange. And by the way, Nomad Pixel, yeah, I really like the Razer keyboards, the orange mechanical switches. They're like my favorite switches by far. But the build quality on Razer keyboards and the software is freaking terrible. I don't install their driver, and I have to buy new keyboards fairly frequently because their build quality is so terrible. So, like, if Razer would just stop being a terrible company and actually just, like, produce high-quality versions of their orange switches that work in a keyboard that doesn't require a freaking terrible piece of software to use, they would be by far the recommended keyboard that I would recommend. But as it is, I can't really recommend their keyboards because everything else about their company sucks. So I would actually say don't buy Razer, even though I buy Razer, because their company is literally that bad. All right, so yeah, and please, someday, if anyone can produce a keyboard that's like a high build quality, non-driver based keyboard that has something similar to a Razer Orange switch in it, please tell me. I will switch to your keyboards, and I will tell everyone else to switch to your keyboards. MX Brown is not even remotely similar to a Razer Orange switch. It's not similar in any way. I have MX Brown switch keyboards here. They are literally nothing like Razer Orange switches, even a little bit. I wouldn't even consider them as related. They're completely different. MX Brown and Razer Orange. They are nothing alike to type on whatsoever. What's the difference is that they feel literally nothing alike. I don't know what an actuation profile would actually tell you because, I can only say what happens when you try to type on the actual keyboard. But Razer Orange switches and Cherry MX Browns do not feel anything alike at all. Like, you would never mistake one for the other ever, unless you just don't, like, have any perception of what's happening with a keyboard, for example, right? But basically, like, yeah, Razer Orange switches are the best switches by far for, like, feel, in my opinion. But they just don't, like, the keyboard just kind of sucks. So what are you going to do? Zelio purple switches, huh? I would try that. Like, there's a lot of switches out there, right? So for all I know, there's like maybe those feel the same as Razor Orange, right? And if they do, maybe I could find, I haven't tried enough switches. I've tried some. I one time bought one of those like switch testing packs, and none of the switches felt like a Razor Orange in that pack, but it was still only like 10 different types of switches, and there's a lot more switches than 10. So yeah, if somebody who really likes Razor Orange switches tries some other switches and ever finds one that's close, please tell me, because I would want to try it as well. That's what I would say. So if someone does try the Zelio purples and finds that they feel the same or quite similar to a Razor Orange switch, that would be really nice to know, because I would love to be able to buy a better keyboard than this keyboard, but have the same kind of feel. So yeah, please keep me posted if anyone really does find one that feels like Razor Orange. Don't just tell me to buy some random switch, because I don't believe you. Like, I want to know that you actually tested them and feel like you can't really tell the difference between a Razor Orange and whatever this new switch is. And then I would try it. But only if you've actually done that and can't tell the difference. Like, you blind taste tested it, right? All right, so yeah, let's find out why our sounds aren't launching, because that's a good thing to do at the end of the stream today, and then next week we can pick up on animation or whatever. So here's the thing that like feeds these into the asset tag hash. This whole system is just garbage now because it's been through so many iterations and we kind of changed the way we're doing things. But just because it's garbage doesn't mean it doesn't work or shouldn't work. So it would be nice to know why, like, whatever is happening there that's not actually working. So let's see if we can get some kind of an explanation here as to what's actually going on. So we've got a... Yeah, I mean, we've got a pretty straightforward thing. It's going to stick the type ID in here, which should be, asset audio. And maybe we should go in and just verify that. So, like, we can do... a thing where we basically say, when you see an asset audio, let's go ahead and stop right there. We could even go one further and say, if tag 0 equals tag bloop, stop here as well. And that way we can just set breakpoints to see, do we actually ever register these sounds that we're looking for? Do they ever actually get loaded? Because if they don't, then, well, that would give us a clue right there to what's gone wrong. So inside here, we've got some stuff. And I'll go ahead and set a breakpoint at these little darlings. I don't think that's the right thing. It's not. That's not what I meant. So what I actually want is like this. So here we can see that, we've got our asset audio, and then we've got tag 0, and it looks like channel index. So maybe that's most of what's going on here, is that we just forgot that channel index comes through first, right? And the sound comes in next. So we don't care about channel index. So that pretty much tells us everything we needed to know. I don't know how exactly we want to handle that. Like what we want to do with channel indexes. One thing we could do is strip them for now. The other thing we could do is sort them to the end. I don't know. I feel like it should kind of go into the match vector is what it really should do. So that's kind of a tougher question, but like, so in here where we've got this, facing direction and variant, I don't know if maybe like this needs to have one more thing in it that's going to be the channel, or maybe the channel is sort of like duplicative of that, facing direction and channel are overlaid. I don't really know. But you would basically say that for now anyway, we just do this. And that way you don't put the channel index in anywhere. You just kind of have, what is it complaining about? There's an access violation reading the tag. What? What are you talking about? Show me that again. That makes no sense to me. What is the problem here? How did this end up being out of bounds? This should not have altered the size of anything. Right? Like, this should not have changed this, any of this stuff. So I don't quite see why we would have... Like, I don't see why that would have caused a problem. Just taking channel index out of... I mean, literally all we did was this, right? As far as I know. Because that's a non-thing. I mean, I'll verify that it's a non-thing, just in case. But, because I want to make sure maybe I'm missing something. So if I rebuild and... oops, that was still running. So if I rebuild and we don't have that extra define, presumably we still get the error. And so what you're telling me is literally it's just this? I am so confused now. So what did we touch? I must have accidentally done something. But how did we break that? Because there's nothing here. We didn't change anything, did we? Did I accidentally typo something when I was not paying attention? Like this can be restored to its previous state, right? And this can be restored to its previous state. And now there's no changes. So explain to me what's going on. How is that possible? We didn't touch anything. This is the problem with programming on stream. Like, none of this stuff should be happening, but programming on stream is just so incredibly difficult. And the code comes out so much worse. It's really kind of hard to convey just how much harder it is than when you get to program on your actual own. So all right, fine, whatever you say. So basically what we're saying is here inside the HHA, when we actually iterate over these, we've got a bogus like HHA tag overlay, right? Like the series of tags that we get is somehow, grotesquely incorrect, right? And so, when we step in here, I guess what we would expect to see is that the assets HHA eventually gets these two values are garbage, right? So what happens is this in here, right? We're going to see this become somehow totally wrong. So this is what we expect to see, just like uniform. Yeah. So eventually we just get to one that's just complete garbage, like the asset that we're asked to process is just complete nonsense. So like asset 173 is the garbage in this case. If we look at the assets, we can see that that's not a particularly high valued thing, right? It's not like that's somehow totally ridiculous. You know what I mean? So it's weird that we would be having that problem that early on in when we loaded the asset out. So it does seem a bit strange, and when we're actually doing this merge here, when we load through these files, like something has gone horribly wrong, and somehow we did that by like touching this thing just lightly, right? Like we didn't do anything, which is absurd, but that's what happens, so you just have to deal with it, right? So what is going on here? What is happening in the chat? Do I need to step in here? Yeah, looks like you guys can handle this on your own. Anyway, what I will say is that the reason that open source software is bad has nothing to do with the quality of the software. The reason open source software is bad is because it exploits workers. It's ridiculous that people who claim to be like, pro worker or pro whatever would ever support open source software, because all it does is basically allow other people to profit off of work they didn't pay for. That's literally the only thing that open source has done, as far as I can tell. Like entire corporations that now effectively control most of the digital world, Google, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, they were all built off of work they did not pay for. Like 90% of the software at those companies was done by workers who were completely exploited in like the traditional like way that Karl Marx would have been very upset about, right? They did a bunch of work. Other people came and basically took control of large swaths of the economy using their work and paid them either nothing or almost nothing versus how much money they extracted out of those pieces of software. That's what happened, right? And there's no alternate read to open source than that, period. That is just literally what occurred. So that's really the only thing people should be talking about with open source right now, as far as I'm concerned, is how to figure out how to stop workers from being exploited, because that is the only thing happening in open source right now that I can see at all, is people doing work and getting completely exploited by effectively like a managerial class that takes their work for free and adds very small amount of value to it and takes all the money, right? So that's what open source looks like to me. That's what the story of the world is, right? So like, solve that. That's the thing you should be talking about, not the software quality yet, because as far as open source versus closed, because I don't think open source versus closed source is really necessarily, I don't think the big issue there has anything to do with code quality. That's a separate issue that we could talk about, and whether open or closed source is better or worse for that is kind of more of a thing, more of a subtle discussion. The fact that open source is massively exploitative of the working class is undisputable, in my opinion. Like there's no way you could possibly make an argument that that's not what happened, because it's like so overwhelmingly obvious that people who did not do the majority of the work now has the majority of the money and power. And it was all thanks to open source software, right? So you're going to have to figure that out before we can have any other discussion about open source, in my opinion, because it's a huge problem and completely exploitative and unfair as it currently stands. All right, so how the heck did this happen? What we need, like, a good forensics that's like, how did what I did knock this like fairly precarious stuff into a bad state, right? Like, how did that happen? It's a strange beast, right? It's a strange beast there, whatever just occurred. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? So so I guess I would say, like, is this something where I accidentally typed in some kind of a weird like overwrite bug or something? Or did this actually write some garbage to it? I don't actually know. Again, because this is a bit yeah, it's a bit weird here. Right? So as the files go, they've already been loaded. So, you know, this part here, so I suppose that makes sense. Let's look at what this is doing. So here we're just reading data from the file. Here's the header. Not sure I understand what that means. Are those like encoded in some way? 'Cause that's kind of weird, right? Can you put a data parent is always the next once or the? I just wanted to, before we get to that point, I wanted to try and find out whether it was an actual change or whether this is actually what's in the file, right? Because I don't actually know what kind of bug I'm looking for at the moment. So what does the file info say? All right, so I guess that all is actually what it actually. That all is just what it is, right? That's all actually accurate, in theory. It's the intro cutscene. Yeah, like this stuff is just like way too complicated, right? And that's what happens. This is why I say like stream programming is terrible, because like this stuff should just be simplified massively. And if you were working on this sort of thing full time, these kind of things get resolved. They do not get resolved when you have to program on stream, and it's very unsatisfying. So if we look at what all these files actually are once they've been loaded, right? So now we're gonna like make the merge thing. We have the internal one that pushes the size out that's just for adding stuff at runtime, but we don't like that's not actually, that wouldn't be happening if the game was actually running as it normally does, right? So now we loop through these and we're going to like read the tags out of the files into their final like destinations, right? And then we're going to read the assets out and adjust the tags, which maybe is broken, right? So it's after this first file does not have any errors in it, right? Because the asset count, we get through up to like asset 173 or whatever, is just fine. So the file asset count for the first one here, this is just fine. There's no, right? Like this will just work, and it's only once we get to the next file that's the one that is busted, right? So in other words, this part of the code here, we actually like we can get down to this temp memory block in theory, right? And it's just fine. And we have 170 assets, all of which are fine. So it's only when we get to this next part of the shenanigans, right, that things go pear-shaped, and we're loading like a bunch of assets and a bunch of tags in here, and we're loading them out of this like tag base, which we guess I don't care about that because really it's the asset that's garbage. So we don't really care about the tag loading now that I think about it. It's really just this at the moment. So we look at file asset count and we're like, we're going to load 3,113 or whatever out of this thing. So we load it in like so. We load in the annotations, and then we loop through the assets like one at a time. And right, there's a bunch of them. And we can see which global one we're going to be on here at each time. And we can look at the source asset and the destination asset, right? It'd be this is what we were copying. So the HHA asset is what we've loaded out of the file, and it's this. Which is garbage for sure. Right? So this is just garbage. So for some reason this file it just has pure garbage in it, I believe. So for whatever reason, this particular file is just messed up. Is there any, like, which file is this? This is the base game file. So somehow the base game file got totally borked. I mean, right? How is that possible? We didn't do anything. Like, we must have done something that caused our file to get screwed up somehow. But I don't know what we did that could possibly have done that. So yeah, I don't know. That's a real strange one. Although, like, apparently that one was okay. Like, am I misreading this? Somehow? What is going on here, folks? Like, how is that not? I guess the way this is working is that you don't see the crash yet, or you don't get a crash yet, because since these two tags are the same, you don't process anything, because you'd loop between them. If you ever went to load the data, it would completely fail, right? So something has gone horribly, horribly wrong with, like, our loading of the HHA file. The base game HHA is somehow completely destroyed, but we don't really have any idea why that would be, right? Meanwhile, our cutscene HHA file is, like, fine. Right? So did we actually, like... So I don't know how we did that, and I don't... Yeah. I don't know how we did that, and I also don't know, like... I mean... It doesn't make a lot of sense. So I guess my next question would be... So if we rebuilt it, does this problem go away? Meaning, is this... Did we just corrupt the file somehow? Or is this nothing to do with that, right? So we run it and... Oops. We run it and we crash here, and the data looks like garbage that we're loading out of the file, right? If we delete the base game HHA file so it's gone... Oops. And then we rerun the program, what happens? Like, because now it's just going to like rebuild that HHH file from scratch by loading all of the like source assets and like smushing them together into a file. Did we just break that at some point? And since we never bothered to like rebuild these data files, we just didn't see that it was messed up? Because that's very plausible, right? Or is that not what happened? So there's it. It rebuilt the game asset data, right? And now if I go, I don't quite remember how any of this stuff worked, but basically I think you just say, do I have to hit save, or does it just automatically save? I think it's just automatically saves that. I'm not quite sure. Looks like it automatically saves the base game HHA. So now we run it and it's right again. So like somebody corrupted that. So probably just bugs the incremental update, I guess. We probably need to clean that system up, right? I mean, we've been cleaning up all the other systems. At some point, that one's going to be on the table, certainly. But it looks like that was the problem. So now the question is, well, if that was the problem, does that mean now that this can be restored? So like if I do this again and put back in the part that I previously had to remove because everything seemed to be totally borked, can we now just include this thing again? Where did it go? This. So this exact code that I wrote before, right? Like so, which should not have had any deleterious effects. It is that. Can we just run it and expect to now be back where we started without the weird bug? The answer appears to be yes. Oh god. So there seems to be some audio tearing and stuff in there. There's also the fact that apparently there's no actual stopgap on that attack code. So that's a bit bad. But now we're back to square one. So that's all fine. That was like launching like hundreds of sounds, which is not a good thing, to say the least. So yeah, like if we want to, where is attacked? Yeah, you can kind of see like this is just not what you would want at all, to say the least. So you would want to do a thing where you look to see if you weren't attacking previously. So this you can't really leave like that, but otherwise it's fine. So we do have sound effects in there. Currently, we would need a way of being a little bit more selective about triggering them, but otherwise, you know, no big deal. So I'll take this out temporarily because until we would have a way to just do a single trigger, we probably wouldn't want something like that to happen. But that's fine. And then if we go to like, I want to say, that the music is a thing. And we could restore that as well now if we wanted to. Again, just to double check that this stuff works at all, which, you know, some of it's kind of rotted. So we don't really need the match vector stuff quite exactly the way it was here. This is, again, not actually necessary. But if we have it all, so if we just go like this and say the channel, so the channel 0 ID and the channel 1 ID are really just going to be tag, yeah, I don't know what we called this music, or did we even include this music? That, maybe we don't even have the music. Do we? Is that even still in here? We may have to add like a sound. We may have to add a thing for the music, because I don't actually know if it's here at all. It kind of looks like it's not. So we might have to look into the sources directory and just see if we've got any music. We don't. Okay, so we do have a music test WAV there. And the music test WAV is in intro cutscene, so maybe we did put it in to one of these HHTs as just intro. Yeah, we did. So it's tagged title screen. I don't know why, but it is. So we can do this, where we ask for the best match sound. And the asset match vector, we can pull out individual channels pretty trivially. We would just do match element channel equals 0, and then 1. And that would be how we would pull out a stereo sound, right? And all this stuff goes away entirely. And like, it's much cleaner now. Like, we did clean up that part quite a bit compared to what it was. So in theory, that's the music. Why we're pulling out both channels, I don't know, because we only play one of them, but I guess we were just, I mean, I don't know. We're just playing around, I guess. So you can see we're getting a lot of tearing there. Right? And I'm guessing that's because, in fact, you know what? I know it's because we don't have sound on a separate thread currently, right? So when the speed, when this speed is off, then you're just going to get tearing. So we probably will have to move sound to its own thread soon if we want to start playing with sound, which we probably do, right? So, for example, if you take a look in Win32, so in here, right, this get sound samples, fill sound buffer, you can see that it's synchronous with the frame update, right? And so because we now don't hit 60 hertz locked, and probably won't during development, at least, we would want to move this out. And that's a nice thing to do anyway. We are kind of already prepared to do it, because you can kind of see, like, while not entirely ready, while we're not, like, really quite there yet, you can see in the audio stuff when we're doing the sound that we do have a separate call, right? So we've sort of prepared roughly for this eventuality. You know what I mean? But we're just not quite doing that yet. Right? So it doesn't, like, we can ask the game for sound samples on a separate function, but we don't do that threaded. And we have to do a little bit of work here, because at the moment, this code would not be thread safe because of this loop, right? So like if you look at how this loop is working here, you've got these playing sounds, right? This is not, gonna cut it, because if someone comes along and tries to play a sound while you're in the middle of iterating, this would break. Just one of the reasons why you don't write things this way. But keep in mind, this was old code. It was written, when I didn't really do very much multi-threaded programming. So it's, it's not what I would write today, but, that's just to be expected. Multi-threaded programming is much bigger now, so I write most of my code multi-threaded. When I started Handmade Hero, that was not true, right? So we'll probably have to take that up soon. Maybe let's leave this on so that we'll maybe do that first thing. And that way we can have some sound effects, because we'd like to sort of get that part of the loop working. And while we're kind of doing the stuff of like, okay, let's put in movement cues and some sound effects and, some reactions, that just sort of stuff. We probably just want all that stuff to mix together. So we'll just kind of do like basic threading of the audio layer. And basic sort of like movement resolution stuff. And we'll call that like our next kind of goal, right? Like sort of making it feel more gamey, doing game-like things, and cleaning up the code in the places that we need to make that reasonable. I'm going to call it there. And I'm going to call it there. So I don't have anything else to say besides that's the end of it. If one wanted to spawn a second window, how would one go about tackling it? I don't really know what you mean. Obviously, you can just call create window twice. I don't really understand the question. There's some nasty stuff that OpenGL just kind of sucks for stuff like that. So OpenGL is really annoying because it's hard to do things like render to multiple windows unnecessarily. So you can do OpenGL with two windows. It's just ugly. You have to unbind and bind to the different HTC, but it works. I do it all the time. DirectX is easier because you can just target a specific window, right? It's not difficult. But either way, there's not a lot to it. You just open a new window, and then whatever you're going to do to render, you do it to one window, and then you do it to the other window. That's it. There really isn't much to it. If it helps, you can even think of it as not really being two separate windows. You just think of it as rendering one big thing and then just putting part of it to one window and part of it to another, right? So... So anyway, let's call that a day. I'll be back here next weekend to look at that, but I think we're good to go, right? I think we are good to go. Oh, it's the problem with exploitation of the working class, really an open source problem. You still can have a commercial licensing on an open source code base, right? Well, no, let me be clearer. I'm just telling you what happened, right? You can hypothesize if there might be solutions to the problem, but who cares? So if you can solve the problem, then great, go solve the problem. But the problem currently is that's what happened. So it's really no good saying, well, you could have done open source differently and this wouldn't be a problem. Well, okay, great. But you didn't, right? So anything that someone says about open source being able to work properly so that people don't get exploited is purely speculative, right? So if you can go demonstrate it, great. Go ahead and do that. And then we're great. But so far, nobody, period, has done this. The only thing that's happening in open source right now is like massive exploitation of working programmers. To this day, that is all that's happening in open source anywhere, as far as I can see. Even the people who are getting paid to work on open source are getting massively underpaid to do it compared to how much the people who are using their code are making, right? So you can say that there's solutions, and great, I hope there are, but until someone actually demonstrates that those solutions work, it's kind of the standard like real communism has never been tried argument. Well, I don't really care about something that you say hypothetically works, but that you haven't demonstrated actually does. So someone has to actually prove to me that open source can work and thrive while still properly allocating the correct amount of payment to the people doing the work, in my opinion, before I'm willing to say that it's any good. Because so far, all it seems to do to me is a massive transfer from labor to management. That's all I see, right? And I have seen nothing else happen economically with open source other than basically like a massive transfer of wealth from programmers to managers. So that's what happened. Can it be fixed? I mean, I don't know. Probably. I mean, anything can be fixed if you work hard at it, but will it be fixed? I doubt it. Certainly, there's no indications that it will change at all in the near future. It's going exactly as it was going, right? So I am not optimistic about the prospects of open source as a fair economic model because the only thing it's currently doing is transferring wealth from programmers to managers, and the only thing I see is that trend accelerating, if anything. Because as a generation of programmers has basically been duped into thinking that their hard work should just be given away for free, it becomes increasingly difficult for people to argue that you shouldn't release your code open source, right? So until somebody actually is able to turn this around, I would say I think open source is very, very bad. It is currently like the very worst thing currently going because it is so incredibly exploitative. It's far more exploitative than any actual company is right now of the workers who work at the company. Open source is way more exploitative than that right now, and that it should be considered a great cause for concern for basically all for anyone who wants to see people fairly compensated for their labor and not have their labor exploited to produce power centers that they then are subject to themselves, right? Because that's what's currently going on. Like working programmers are creating code, they're releasing it for free use on the internet, and then people use that code without really compensating them almost at all. Sometimes they compensate them a little bit. Usually it's not very much. Certainly it's nothing compared to the power that then is accreted by the people who have co-opted that work thanks to the open source model. And then basically then what you get is, you just get Mark Zuckerberg gets to define how the internet works despite having paid for almost none of the software that his company actually needed to make that work, right? So that's the situation. And until I see someone proving that there's a solution in practice, I just don't endorse open source anymore, right? I would like there to be ways like for example, models more like people who pay for the software get to get a license to the source code, but they are not allowed to do anything with it outside of other people who have paid for it or something. Things like that I could see being useful, but like I really just don't see we post stuff on GitHub under a GPL 2 or LGPL or Apache or MIT license. that's just all that is now it's just exploitation. That's all it is to me. Because it's so obvious, like, how many very bad things have happened on the back of these workers who basically produce the code necessary for all of these companies to exist at all. They would none of them been able to get started. Facebook doesn't exist without PHP, Apache, Linux. Facebook would never even have gotten day one without those people. And now those people who built all those things, I mean, whether you think PHP sucks or not, Facebook doesn't exist without it. The people who made PHP have no say in what happens on Facebook. They have no power at all. They get no decision-making authority. They do not share in the profits. They basically just get handouts that Facebook decides to give them if they choose to give them to them at all. And that, to me, is completely unacceptable. It's just completely unacceptable. The people who do the work should have the just compensation for what they did, and they should have a fair voice in what happens with their labor. And I don't necessarily go as far as like a full Marxist view of something like that, where I think that you can't have like a capital class and investment and stuff like that. But my point here is this was done without even the capitalism model, meaning nobody paid up front for those people to make PHP. Facebook did not pay them, right? So it's not even like it's much more like feudalism or serfdom than anything else open source is. These people just did the work and got nothing for it. They weren't even paid up front by the people who ended up using it, which is one of the rationales for like the capitalist approach, is that, well, these people are providing you a salary before you did the work. So to me, that's a lot more fair. Here, that didn't even happen. They are not getting a salary. They got nothing. They did the work for free originally, and then were completely exploited at the end of it. It's kind of like if you took the worst of socialism and the worst of capitalism and combined them, that's open source. Right? It like that's the only real way I can think to define it. It's like if you took the worst aspects of capitalism for workers and the worst aspects of socialism for workers and you put them together, that's what you get open source. It's the you get no power and you get no money. That's what it is, right? So it's like the worst of both things. I just don't know any way to say it. It's very, very upsetting to me. It's very, very upsetting to me, right? Greg Inc., I disagree. Just because someone chooses to let you exploit them does not mean you didn't exploit them. Exploitation is true objectively. It is not have anything to do with whether someone was okay with it, right? So it's exploitative, period. It doesn't matter whether the people chose to be exploited, right? Because you can choose to be exploited. You can choose to be submissive. You can choose all those things. Nobody said it was coercive, but it's very exploitative, right? And for the record, that's how most exploitation works. Most exploitation is about convincing people that they're doing something that they should, convincing them to do something that turns out to be very bad for them and very good for you. And that's exactly what the open source movement has turned out to be, right? So fix it. Stop doing that. I think there's some people who've been trying different licenses, like there's a GPL license now, right? That that requires basically it to maintain open source even if it's used on like a server or something like that. You know what I'm saying? KH Betas, yeah, I mean, I think there is, like, there was a new GPL license that's designed to fix the problem of Facebook, right? There's a new GPL license that's like, look, if you use this source code, even if you run it privately, you have to release all your source code as well, right? That goes with it. AGPL, yeah. And that's really like, you're gonna have to do something like that if you want open source to survive, or you do the opposite thing, which is you have to pay a reasonable payment for your open source, or something. But yeah, the AGPL is really the only thing that I've seen so far that's an attempt to fix these fundamentally unfair compensation practices, because it really just requires a certain amount of legal enforcement. If you want the source code to be open, there has to be licenses, right? So anyway, I see it as a very bad situation, and people need to really rethink how this is structured. It's not acceptable currently. It should be fixed. It should be fixed. And the people who create these foundational pieces of software that other companies choose to use to build their businesses on, they should be getting percentage ownerships of these companies or percentages of their earnings, just like a shareholder, right? Because the company simply could not have existed without this open source software. Greg, yes. So in well, two things. First of all, Handmade Hero is closed source. For starters, right? So you have to pay to get the source code, and you cannot use it in your own stuff, right? But the Handmade Hero eventual thing was, at some point after the game is out, I will eventually allow the source code to be reused. I would not have made that decision today, right? And we certainly will never do that with another one of our products. But no, even Handmade Hero is not open source currently. And again, that's to try and strike that balance. It's to say, look, this is like actual. If you think this is useful, you should have to pay for it, right? Because that's the only real fair way to go. That said, Handmade Hero is not really a foundational technology, so it's not really similar. The level of exploitation that can happen based off of Handmade Hero is not very large, right? It's not a fundamental technology like something like a web server. So, the chances that I will get fairly compensated for Handmade Hero are much higher, right? Than the chances that you'll get fairly compensated for something like Linux, if that makes sense. So, even though Handmade Hero does have an eventual source code release component to it, it's also, even though I wasn't as concerned about open source then, I still did think that it being open source was not appropriate, so that's why I didn't do that. But yeah. But like I said, the degree to which someone else can profit off of Handmade Hero source code is very low anyway. So it's not a problem compared to something like, OpenSSL or something, right? Like whatever things are that are like, if you're working in that kind of space. You know what I mean? Arcandos, there's generally the general rule for stuff like that is it depends on the license sometimes, but in general, restraint of trade laws basically says that like people can't control your learning per se. So like if you're not literally copying code from one place to another, you're usually okay, right? Restraint of trade laws basically say that, stuff that you learn while you're working on something, absent very specific language barring you from employing that education elsewhere, you're really not liable for, copyright infringement or whatever it might be. So long as what you were doing was you learned something and then you repeated that learning somewhere else legitimately, right? You weren't just making an excuse. You know what I mean? Are you using any open source code in your proprietary code? No, we use literally zero open source code currently. I was thinking of using Bare SSL, and maybe at some point I might use Bare SSL in something, but it turned out we ended up not. No, we do not use Sean's libraries. Currently, no, we don't use OpenGL, but OpenGL also isn't open source, right? So, like, the degree to, if you use OpenGL on Windows, you're using closed source. No, we don't use STB for fonts. I have my own font stuff. OpenGL also isn't an open spec. It is neither open source nor an open spec. OpenGL has a lot of very contractual restriction things. OpenGL is its own whole thing. It doesn't matter anyway because you don't really need to use it anymore. But so basically, it's fine if I learn from your stream, then close the stream and implement something like you, for example, downloading architecture. But if I yeah, I mean that's generally the idea, right? Is that education, you can't really stop, and there's obvious good reasons for that, right? Otherwise it would just be too difficult to police if people could claim that you learned to do something from them and you weren't allowed to do that or whatever, right? It's pretty tough. So generally speaking, the law tends to expect that look, if you don't want someone to learn how to do something, then you have to keep it secret, or you have to sign an agreement with them that they won't go do something. If it was some kind of thing where you were working with me specifically and we basically had a non-compete agreement that for 5 years afterwards you couldn't go work on games or something, right? So that tends to be more how those things are. In general, you don't have protection for things like learning. If someone learns to do something and they weren't copying you, they learned to do stuff and then they went and wrote their own, that's not considered copyright infringement. Right. It can be patent infringement, certainly, because if things are patented, then they're patented and there is no defense. If you did the same thing, then you're liable. It's one of the reasons I don't like patents, because that just seems too much, but there are a lot of practical drawbacks to OpenGL. It's not as well supported on Windows. It doesn't have as good of just general operating system support for it. Things like multi-threading are harder, et cetera, et cetera. So, for a very simple game, AV Racer isn't asking a whole lot of the graphics subsystem, so it's totally fine. But as you want to do more complex stuff, you probably really don't want to use OpenGL. How to calculate how much should go to an open source project if I make profits in percent, let's say. I mean, we can't right now. That's kind of the point. Is there, currently the answer is 0%. You don't have to give anything to them. And I think that's just a very bad economic model. And so, it's not really up to you to figure that out. It was up to the industry to come up with a less stupid model for how power and money, which are very intimately related, right? Money kind of is power in modern society to a large extent. Because money fundamentally is a thing that allows you to allocate resources, and that's sort of what power is, right? So it's really kind of up to the industry to fix it. It's not up to you. It's not up to you to be charitable. It's up to the industry to wake up and stop using this as a fundamental model because it's completely broken. So, yeah, and that's that. Let's see what's going on in Raidland.